Hello, this is Daniel and welcome to the third part of my character modeling tutorial series. So today we're going to look at ZBrush, and if you're wondering why ZBrush all of a sudden, I received some comments last week asking for the same thing I did for Blender, which was also a quick introduction to sculpting there. So I decided to do that very quickly before moving forward with this character creation project. However, I know that you have been already waiting for a long time, for 3 weeks, to finally get started with this character. So I decided to publish 2 videos just today, so that you don't have to wait forever until we finally get started with this character. So with that out of the way, finally we'll also be doing a very quick Q&A at the very end, so if you're interested, well, take a look at that as well. And then finally, before we get started, here's one more time the character design that we're working towards in case you're new to this series. And for those of you who have already watched the previous episodes, I finally found a name for this character. So she'll be called Nozomi from now on. I really hope you liked the name, but let's move on to today's topic and switch to ZBrush. So here we are then in ZBrush. This is the 2020 edition. And in this video, we're just going to look at the basic features and all the things that you need to get started with your sculpting project. I'll try to give you all the tools that you need to follow this series. But one thing I want you to know is that ZBrush is quite a complicated software to use. It is very unintuitive. Many things are very different from what you're used to. And it can be very easy to get frustrated about it, especially when you're starting out learning it. But I just want you to know that that's how everybody feels, and I felt that way as well, of course, at the beginning. But if you just don't give up, if you keep going and try to learn it over and over, at some point you'll figure it out. At some point we all figure it out. It's just very confusing at the beginning. So again, this is the interface, and at the bottom you see some of my custom, you can customize your user interface. This is something you won't be seeing, but it doesn't matter too much. But let's take a look at the interface as a whole. One of the first things that you want to try is to make a stroke on the screen, and you'll see that you get a stroke, but this is very far away from what we know as sculpting. In fact, you might think that this is closer to drawing, because you can't even rotate the view, you can't, zoom really or anything. In fact, ZBrush works very different from other 3D tools that we know. It's based sort of on this canvas, and that's really a 2-dimensional drawing with depth information. And there is a whole story about why ZBrush is built in this way, but I really don't want to get into this story at all, and I will try to skip this whole topic as much as possible. In fact, I just want to show you how to quickly get around this and move forward into the sculpting mode. By the way, one thing I didn't quite mention yet is that on the right side of your screen I will be writing down some notes. So, if you watch this video again and quickly want to find what I'm currently talking about, just look at the right side of the screen. So let us take a look. I'll just bring up very quickly the first couple of talking points, and let's talk about those. So we won't care much at the moment about this strange situation here. This is not 3D yet at all. So let me just show you 2 things. One is how you create a new document. This document is not your project file. If you save, okay, let's talk about saving and opening first. If you want to save your file, never save here in document. Of course, this sounds like this is what you would have to do to save your file, but don't do it here. Go to file and save it here. Because if you save your document, you're only going to save a snapshot, a 2-dimensional image of what you have on the screen. You have to save the file in order to get all your 3D data, all the tools, and so on. That's something, first of all, I wanted to mention. Then secondly, you see that you have this canvas that has a certain size, and outside there is nothing. You can't even draw on it. This is of course the document, and it has a resolution, And what you want to do is click here on New Document, and that will give you a new document that has the size of your screen. And so that's what you want to do at the very beginning, just to, you know, get ZBrush to give you the right size of the document. And this is the area that you'll be working in, so that should pretty much set you up for what comes next. Now, to clear the layer, so you know, sometimes you create something on here and we really don't need these strokes. We want to know how to clear it, and you can simply press Ctrl N, or you can go to layers and hit clear. That will basically clear your canvas. So that's all about the document, and next I'll very quickly add a few comments about the user interface. There's mostly, I suppose, one concept that I want you to understand, and that's that here at the top you have some menus, which can be toggled, by the way, so if they're not visible, maybe you want to take a look at this button. But all these buttons that you see, apart from those menus, are stored and available somewhere in here. For example, if we take a look at this stroke picker, if you go to the stroke menu, you find the exact same tool or button in here as well. Or these little buttons here, you might think that these are, well, something that belong to the 3D view or something. But no, these are also just buttons that are available somewhere in the menus. So if you want to just, you know, see all the functionalities of ZBrush, you just can go through all these menus, and you will basically have seen all the things ZBrush can do without missing anything. And you can, by the way, customize this just like I did here with these at the bottom, but that's something I think it would be best if you just find a different video for that. It's a bit beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. So now that you know that, you can also probably already guess that all these other areas here are just panels that, you know, where you can swap your elements. This drawer here as well is basically a place where you can you know, attach an entire menu. So here I just loaded the entire stroke menu into this. You can hold Alt and drag on this little icon to drag it out or drag it in, whatever you need. But the tool panel is the one that you will be using the most. So just leave that on the right side. That's what I recommend at least. And finally, one last thing about the user interface. You have many buttons and it's hard to know what they do sometimes. If you hover over them, you get a little tooltip and sometimes also the shortcut if it has one. But in order to really learn more about what this button does, if you press the Control key, you get this whole documentation about this feature, and that's very nice. So if you want to know what this particular button does, just hold Control and it will give you a nice explanation of what it does. So now we can get started with some more relevant topics for sculpting. So basically, what you want to do is you want to create a 3D object that you can sculpt on. So the way you do that is, in case you haven't noticed yet, you make a stroke here and you get this stroke. And you can change what happens when you make a stroke by clicking on this little box here. And there is some other 2.5D brushes that you could be using. For example, the smudge brush does smudge your sketch, whatever it is. But we don't really need those at all, so just forget about these brushes here. We want to look at these 3D objects. So clear your canvas with Ctrl N, and let's try that. So we created sphere, and now let's sculpt on it, but you know, somehow we get new spheres over and over, and it can be really confusing, and I really had trouble finding out how you actually get to sculpt something. So let's clear our canvas one more time, and I'll create one sphere. And what you have to do is, now that you have one object on your canvas, you click here on edit mode and just never leave edit mode again. So this is going to be now your 3D scene. You can see I can navigate around it, I can zoom, I can pan around, this is how you get started with sculpting. But one more thing you need to understand is that these sort of preset objects here that you have are primitives. They're not meshes, so to say. They have some parameters that you can change in this initialize panel, like the resolution, for example. But in order to convert them into a sculptable mesh, you have to press this button, Make Polymesh 3D. That will convert that into a polymesh, and now you can finally sculpt on it. So that's sort of this story about 2.5D brushes, primitives, and then converting them into polymesh 3D type tools. You can also import OBJ files here, by the way. Those will be imported directly as polymesh 3D, so you can directly sculpt on those. Now finally we know how to sculpt, but this is all very, very confusing in the long process. Here's what I recommend you to do. You just go to this Lightbox, which is a content browser, and you click on this Dyna Mesh Sphere 128, and this is just a clean scene where you can directly start to sculpt, and you don't have to worry about much. Finally, what is a subtool? So every tool which is listed here, by the way, and you can have multiple of tools and work on them. So you can switch between them here or pick one from this box. Each tool can have subtools. So I can try to append here, for example, a cylinder, or let's take something more interesting, this helix. So if I move it up, you see that now I have two objects in my scene, so to say, and I can switch between them by clicking onto them in the subtool panel. And that will allow me to basically have multiple objects, and you see that if I sculpt on them, they don't interfere with each other too much. In that sense, that's a pretty important thing to know. So then let's move forward. Next, we're going to look a little bit at the navigation. So I haven't talked about it yet, so let me mention it now. Basically, a very convenient way to navigate in ZBrush in a 3D scene is to use the right mouse button. If you use the right mouse button, just click it, you can rotate around the view. If you hold Alt and click the right mouse button, you can pan the view. And if you, now this is getting a bit confusing once more, but if you press Alt and then the right mouse button, and then you release Alt, and don't forget you're still holding the right mouse button, then you can zoom the view. It's hard to get used to, but you know, it will be very easy once you have done it often. So those three operations will allow you to navigate the scene, and also there is a little perspective toggle here. You could also go to the draw panel to change the focal length for your perspective, but that's pretty much all you need to know in this regard. And then finally, one thing I already did but I didn't quite explain is how to transform your subtools. You want to look at these four buttons up here. Don't click on this edit button again, because that will take you out of edit mode and just cause you a lot of trouble. We want to look at these four, and you can only have one of these four selected. You can also have the keyboard shortcuts Q, W, E, and R. And basically, if you have the draw mode enabled, you can modify your subtools with a brush. But if you go to move, for example, you get your gizmo, and with it you can do some transformations like moving around your subtool, rotating it, scaling it, and that's something you'll be using a lot. So here you go. Now you know about it. Now let's move forward with our next topic, which is going to be the Sculpting Basics. So then, we're finally at the point where we can start to sculpt. I'll quickly delete my subtool by clicking on this delete button, and now we just have a sphere and it's ready to be sculpted on. So all you need to do is you click with your pen tablet onto the canvas, onto the object, and you'll be making a stroke. Don't forget that we already have turned this into a Make Polymesh 3D, and it's in the edit mode, otherwise it won't work, but Once you're in the right mode, you can quite easily make strokes on your object. If you want to invert your brush, you hold the Alt key and then you can sort of subtract instead of adding onto your object. Undoing is also quite important, of course, in sculpting. You can use Ctrl-Z to undo, but you'll see that you also have a bar here on top, which is your undo history, so you can quickly slide through what you did previously. Now there's one more convenient key that you should know, which is the spacebar. If you hit the spacebar, you get a couple of parameters that change how your brush behaves. You have the draw size, which is your radius, the focal shift, which is sort of the hardness of your brush. You have the intensity, and that's pretty much the things you should know for now, the basics. So here you can change how the brush behaves, just like this. And finally, you will want to change the brush from time to time. You can basically click here on this square and you will get to choose from all those brushes that are available in ZBrush. And there's many. It can be a bit confusing, but in this video I'll be talking about the ones that I like to use the most. So let's take a look at that. Here's very quickly the list. Let's bring them all up and I'll go and talk about all of them. I might change the order up a little bit though, so maybe don't look at the list too much, but let's take a look. The first brush that I want to introduce to you is actually the Move brush. It's here somewhere. There it is. Here's the Move brush. Oh, there we go. And the Move brush is basically what would be called grab in Blender. You just click on your object and you drag a portion of the mesh. And that's very useful with a large radius because you can very quickly get the rough shape of your sculpt ready before you go in and add more detail with some other brush that's more useful for, you know, finer details. So that's how I always start out with my sculpts. Now I'll move back up to my list. Let's take a look at the clay buildup brush, which is my second favorite brush. I use it to, you know, begin sculpting the actual shape of my sculpture. You can use it to, you know, scrape away something if you hold Alt, or you can use it to add something to your object. Always use it in the direction of sort of the form, and that will help you to, you know, reach the result that you want. Now, with that, now that we know that, the next brush that I want to look at is the Smooth brush. You can select the Smooth brush directly, but what is much more convenient is to just use the Shift key. If you hold the Shift key and make a stroke, you'll see that you're smoothing your mesh. Now, holding the Shift button is, however, not assigned particularly to the Smooth brush. It's just that while you're holding the Shift key, you can assign a different brush to, you know, your Shift key. So for example, if I hold the Shift key and I was to change my brush, for example, to the clay brush, now every time I hold the Shift key, my clay brush will be selected. Again, you don't have these icons at the bottom, but you can just go in here and change your brush. So that's why, in case you accidentally change that, hold Shift and select your Smooth brush, and that way you will be able to smooth your object every time you hold the Shift key and make a stroke. And I use that a lot again because the clay buildup brush is a bit rough and you want to smooth out the details selectively without losing you know, your definitive lines. Just smooth out the parts that need to be smoothed out. I'll skip the clay brush for now because I don't use it too often. I'm kind of going by the order of what I use the most. Next brush I want to introduce is the Trim Dynamic brush. It's basically a brush that scrapes away some material, and I'll maybe show it here on the side. You see that it allows you to get very harsh and hard edges on the side, and it can be used for hard surface modeling or just to, you know, scrape away something, but it's very useful. You'll find lots of uses for it, so take a look at it. You can also use it in its inverted mode, in its additive mode, which you get by holding Alt. Try it as well. I think it will be useful. Now, a very similar brush is the H polish brush. You can also, polish and therefore flatten a face. However, it has one advantage. If you have, let me quickly set that up, an edge that is sort of inverted, that goes inside, so to say, it's very difficult to kind of harden these faces. If I was to use the trim dynamic brush, you can add material here. That sort of works. But if you use the brush normally, you always sort of get some change in this other plane as well. But with H polish, if you use this one and you hold Alt and brush over this edge, you'll kind of get this nice and sharp. So I like to use it for these sort of situations. It's very sort of niche, but in such cases it can be very useful. Now what's next? Let's take a look. Oh, there is the Dam standard brush, which is a brush that basically gives you a crease. So let's try it out here. So it's quite self-explanatory if you look at it, but this one can also be very useful to get some creases, some folds done. And I'm smoothing out one side of it. That's something I often do just to give it a little nicer look. So that's another brush that I use a lot as well. And next, let's look at, what should we look at? I think we only have the clay brush and the inflate brush and the remove topology brush left. So the clay brush is very similar to the clay build-up. It's just a smoother version. So if you need to do something that's a bit smoother, you can of course turn up the focal shift. But if you need to do something in a very smooth manner, that brush might be a good start for you. But I don't use it too often. It's just something I sometimes like to use if I really need it. There we go. And then finally there's the Move Topological brush, and if you give it a try, it's actually very similar to the normal Move brush. So what's the difference? Well, basically, if you have separated sort of loose parts in your sculpt, so let me just make a copy of that like this. So if I was to use the Move brush, you will be sort of manipulating both of them at the same time because they're in the same subtool. But the Move Topological brush does consider what's connected, what geometry is connected, and therefore it can be useful if you have some parts that are very close together, like teeth, for example, to just place them and do that sort of thing. So that's almost it for my brush introduction. The last brush that I haven't talked about yet is the inflate brush, and I'm getting so distracted because I'm trying to make this look like something. Okay, let me stop here before I waste too much time. So the inflate brush is going to be inflating just your object. Let's change the focal shift quickly. So just like this, and it can be useful to sort of strengthen your creases or add a little bit of volume into an area where you have already sculpted some smooth details. There are some uses and it can be very important, but I don't use it too often. It's just one brush that when you need it, you really do need it, so I wanted to mention it. But interestingly, apart from these brushes, I don't use any of them actually. Very, very rarely I use some of the other ones, but you won't see me do that too often. Now let's talk about geometry management. There's a couple of things I want to talk about. Let's take a look. There we go. So symmetry is the first topic, and you see that this scene in particular, if you go into the lightbox and open this project, has already symmetry turned on. But if you press X, you'll be able to turn on and off the symmetry. You can also go to transform and activate and deactivate the symmetry here. Choose the axis and maybe even radial symmetry, and that's something we use very often, of course, especially with characters. If you, however, for some reason turn symmetry off and make a change and you need to resymmetrize your object, in the tool panel you can go to geometry and to modify topology and then press mirror and weld. However, you need to know which side it copies from, and I actually modeled the wrong way around. This is actually the front view, but doesn't really matter. You can only mirror in one direction, so be careful with that. If you really need to switch the direction you flip it in, what you have to do is you first go to your deformation panel, you then mirror it, and then you go back to geometry and then you do mirror and weld. That way you can choose which side you want to copy from. Then, now sometimes we might want to start adding more detail. Of course, in sculpting you always start rough first and then you add more detail. By the way, don't forget to turn on your symmetry again by pressing X. So we might not have enough detail and we want to, make progress in our sculpt. There's a couple of ways to do that. You can press divide here in this geometry panel and you'll get more points, and you see that right away we get to do lots of more detailed strokes. However, I don't really use that at all much. Only use this if you have already a clean base mesh that has the topology that you want for your project, and you don't want to lose that topology. You have a slider here with which you can always, increase and decrease the subdivision level. That's a very nice workflow, but the problem with this workflow is that if I went back to level 1 and I decided that I wanted to make a big change in my geometry, like add horns or I don't know what, you'll see that you'll run out of geometry very quickly. You'll get these rough edges, and even if you turn it up, the resolution will be very different. In here we have few points, while here we have a much larger density of points. So it's a bit troublesome. So I only use that if I already know what the mesh is going to be looking like. Instead, what you can do is you can use Dynamesh. So I'm just going to delete my lower levels here in this case. So now this is applied. And I go to Dynamesh. Now Dynamesh is a bit confusing to use, but basically just do this. It's the easiest way. Just turn it off once and turn it back on, and then I don't know if you saw what happened, but I'll show it one more time. If you activate it, it will voxel, it will remesh your object, your subtool, based on its volume, so it will just stretch this sort of generated surface over everything. By doing so, it will also melt everything together. So if you have two separated loose parts and you Dynamesh it, they will melt together. But you can't change the amount of detail that you want, and you'll get a result like this. Now, what's so good about this is that if I made this big change and I'm running out of points, I can quickly hit this and you'll be able to continue with the same density of points all across your object. So that's something I like to use a lot as well. But finally, there's one more tool to use, which is Sculptris Pro. If you have a brush selected that's not the move brush, then you can activate Sculptris Pro here. And what it does is it sort of dynamically generates topology wherever you need it. So here I'm just sculpting and I keep going, and you see I'm never running out of points. That's because it's always creating new points wherever I go. And even if I zoom in and I need finer detail, it will create that finer detail for me. However, one downside to this is that you lose a little bit of your performance advantage, and it can be a bit hard on your computer. So I'm not using it all that often. I only use it when I really need it, and there's some convenient things that it can do. For example, if you smooth this away, you can quickly get rid of some parts of your geometry without having to use some cut tools or stuff. So there's some uses for it, but just maybe play around with it and you'll see when you need it. Instead, I prefer my really preferred method is to use Dynamesh. That way I always have the right resolution, and I'm sure that my density is the same across the entire object. Now, finally, oh, that's actually already it for geometry management. So we can move forward to our next topic, which is masking. So you know already how to sculpt, basically. There we go. But there's something quite important that's used a lot in sculpting, which is masking. Here I'm creating a mask. This is what a mask looks like, and just like the name suggests, it masks the effect of my brush. So if I take now a brush and try to sculpt on it, you'll see that I can't do anything in this region where we have a mask. And that's quite useful for various situations. You can create lots of shapes by using masks, but we need to know how to create them. So basically, you can hold your control key and make a stroke, and that way you make your mask. If you hold Control and Alt, you can subtract from your mask. And then there is also this situation one more time. I explained it already with the smooth brush, but the control key is also just a key that you can assign a brush to. For example, if you hold Control and you click here, you can select other brushes that can be assigned to it. For example, the lasso tool. So now if I hold Control and I drag, you see that I have the lasso tool, which allows me to drag and create a mask like this. But I want to be using the mask pen, which is the one that's set by default, and we'll look at how to use it. Now let's say you have a mask. To invert the mask, what you do is you hold Control and you tap into the background once. If you want to clear the mask, you hold Control and you drag with your mouse in the background once. That's how you clear it. And by the way, if you don't have any mask on your object and you drag on the background with your Control key held down, this will recalculate your Dynamesh. So that's something you might run into, so I'm just mentioning it. It can be confusing, but well, now you know about it. Also, you can easily smoothen your mask by holding Control and clicking onto your mesh, or you can sharpen it by holding Control and Alt and clicking onto your sculpt one more time. Finally, there is the masking panel in here with lots of other settings. You can blur and, for example, grow your mask here as well and sharpen it like this. So a lot to look at. But that's pretty much how masking works, and it can be useful to sculpt various shapes. Next, we'll look at polygroups. And polygroups can be compared to face sets in Blender. But first of all, in order to display polygroups, you have to click on this Draw Polyframe button in here. So that will color your mesh in some color. And what we can do is we can color different parts of the mesh in, well, different colors. So the most important shortcut for doing so is Control W. If you press Control W, everything that is visible will be assigned to a new poly group. So, but this shortcut also has another use. If you have a mask like this, as soon as you press Control W, the masked area will be assigned to a new group, which has a quite similar color at the moment. So let's do that again. Kind of ends up being similar. Doesn't really matter. And anyways, these are now assigned to different polygroups, and therefore we can work with that. Just one more thing I want to show you. If you have multiple loose parts and you go to this Polygroups tab, you can auto-group it, and that will basically assign a different polygroup to each loose part in your sub-tool. So that's very useful and something I think that you should know. Let's go back very quickly, and now let's take a look at what you can actually do with masks, and that leads me into my next topic, which is visibility. Okay, here we go. So basically you can use these polygroups to hide them and unhide them depending on what you need. So the way this works is you basically hover over the polygroup that you want to see, and you press you press Control Shift and then you tap on it. You can unhide, you can basically make everything visible again by once again holding Control and Shift and by tapping onto it one more time. But then you see it actually inverts your... So the next topic will be visibility. Basically, now that we have created polygroups, we can, hide some parts of our mesh, and we can, unhide them depending on what we need. We need to hold Control Shift and click on one of these groups, and that will hide everything else and only leave us with this one group that we wanted to see. If we hold Control Shift and click on this one polygroup that is left, that will in fact invert what is visible. And if I click outside into the background, that will make everything visible again. So let me create a few more polygroups just so that we have actually something to work with. Here we go. Now you can see that if I hover over something and I press Control Shift and click on it, only this is visible. If I click on it again, then everything else is visible. But now, because some part is already hidden, if I now click Control Shift and I select any of these other remaining groups, they will just be hidden until only one group remains. Now if I click on this one, it will once again invert what is visible. It's kind of confusing, I understand, but that's how it works. To unhide everything, you basically hold Control Shift and you tap into the background. And to invert what is visible, you can hold Control Shift and drag in the background in this way. There is one more way to select what is visible. You hold Control Shift and you start in the background and you drag a rectangle onto your mesh. Then only everything that's within this rectangle is visible. You can also press Control Shift and Alt, and then you'll hide that area. But Control Shift is also, just like the other time, something that you can assign something else to. And one thing we could do is, say, select lasso brush, for example. So with this one, if I hold Control Shift now, you get this lasso tool and you can change your visibility in this way. So that is pretty much it for visibility. And actually this, I believe, concludes this introduction to ZBrush. I talked about various topics and I believe it was confusing, but there is no way around it, I believe. ZBrush is quite complicated, but I believe that if you just stick with it and if you want to learn it, eventually you will be able to do it. So with that said, I really want to spend more time on this sculpt because it's really fun to just sculpt freely and be creative about what you do. But anyways, this is not part of this video. Let's go back to our presentation and we'll talk about some more topics. So here, back to the slides. Here very quickly a few questions and answers that I wanted to talk about. So first question, I was asked about the Discord server in the comments last week. Some people were interested to create a community somewhere where we could exchange information and share screenshots, but unfortunately my answer to this one is no for now. It is a bit too much effort for me at the moment to organize this server and to, moderate it, so I'm not going to be creating that anytime soon. But I want you to take a look at the Blender NPR Discord server, which you can find more information about at the link here, because they have a pretty large community already and they are into non-photorealistic rendering, as the name suggests. So definitely take a look there, and I hope you can all have a nice discussion there. I'm also in that server for now, so maybe if I see something that directly relates to the content that I'm creating, I can give some answers as well, but we'll see how much I get to that. Now, another question I received a couple of times already is this series pre-recorded or not? No, actually I'm creating this series as we go, which is also the reason why I'm unable to publish this any faster. So I'm doing my best to, make the quality as good as I can. So I think I will stick to my schedule of one video per week. I think this video is only a bit special because I didn't want to make you wait too long for the actual character modeling. And then finally, one last question which I also got very often is, what is better, Blender or ZBrush? And my answer to that is there is nothing better or worse in that sense. Blender is, in my opinion, a great tool, and I love it for all its features and the whole community, and it's improving every day and one of the most exciting tools that I use. But ZBrush for sculpting in particular has, in my opinion, a performance advantage, and that's pretty much because it is a very focused tool. It is specialized on one particular task, and it does that very well. Not to say that that Blender doesn't have lots of tools, but I suppose that at the moment ZBrush still has a little bit of an advantage. But anyways, it doesn't really matter too much. Use whatever you have basically. You don't need to pay all the money to get a license for ZBrush. You can just use Blender. It's basically up to you. So I'll be answering more questions like this next week, so feel free to ask me more in the comments. I'll be picking up some of those questions, and I hope we can do more Q&As like this. So that's pretty much all I have for this video. This has been the third part of this character modeling tutorial series. We talked about how to sculpt in ZBrush, and we did a quick question and answer session. And in the next video, which will be coming out in a few minutes after this, we'll be talking about character blocking. I hope you enjoyed this episode as always. Of course, consider to like, comment, and subscribe. And you can also support me through Patreon, for which I have posted a link in the description. But regardless, I hope more than anything that this video has been useful to you, and I hope to see you again next time.